Welcome to another episode of Let's Learn to Code for Free. Today we'll be starting the CSS Grid chapter or course. Hopefully we'll finish it. So this is exactly where we stopped last time. Introduction to the CSS Grid challenges. CSS Grid helps you easily build complex web designs. It works by turning an HTML element into a grid container with rows and columns for you to place children elements where you want within the grid. Okay, sounds like it could be very practical. Create your first CSS grid. Turn any HTML element into a grid container by setting its display property to grid. So this gives you the ability to use all the other properties associated with CSS Grid. Note, in CSS Grid, the parent element is referred to as the container, and its children are called items. Okay, container kind of makes sense, but items could be confusing because item is very general, but we'll just have to remember that. Change the display of the div with the container class to grid. Container class display grid. That's it, right? Okay, that's it. Next up, add columns with grid template columns. Simply creating a grid element doesn't get you very far. You need to define the structure of the grid as well. To add some columns to the grid, use the grid template columns property on a grid container as demonstrated below. Container, display grid, grid template columns 50 pixels, 50 pixels. This will give you your grid 2 columns that are 50 pixels wide each. The number of parameters given to the grid template columns property indicates the number of columns in the grid, and the value of each parameter indicates the width of each column, which makes sense. Give the grid container 3 columns that are 100 pixels wide each. Display grid is already here. Grid template columns 100 px, 100 px, 100 px. I wonder what this gray thing is. Okay, so let's quickly look at the code that was already here. So D1, this class has a background color of this, light sky blue, container, font size, width is 100%. Okay, it has background color of light gray, display grid. So if I remove this, we'll just see these classes one after another with this content and these background colors. Okay, it's pretty simple, pretty basic. I'll just I don't have to add this solution. Next up, add rows with grid template rows. The grid you created in the last challenge will set the number of rows automatically. To adjust the rows manually, use the grid template rows property in the same way you use grid template columns in the previous channel. Add 2 rows to the grid that are 50 pixels tall each. So grid template rows, 50 px, 50 px. Okay. Use CSS grid units to change the size of columns and rows. You can use absolute and relative units like pixels and em in CSS Grid to define the size of rows and columns. You can use these as well. fr sets the column or row to a fraction of the available space. Auto sets the column or row to the width or height of its content automatically. Percentage adjusts the column or row to the percent width of its container. Here's the code that generates the output in the preview. So auto for the first column, 50 for the second column, 10% entire width of its container. Oh, so the entire container. Okay, so if I minimize the window, that will also minimize. Yeah, so number 3 depends on, on the size. FR sets the column fraction of the available space. 2 fraction, 1 fraction. So it divides it into 3 and gives this one twice the space as is left, I guess. And what if I do something like, I wonder how it decides to put 4 in front of 3. So why is that? What was 3 using? 3 is using 10% of its container. Okay, that's kind of funny, isn't it? Oh, I get it. It's not funny. Okay. It's not putting it above it. It's just this is the width that's 10% of the container, and the number 3 doesn't fit, so that's all. Okay. Make a grid with 3 columns whose widths are as follows. Second column is right. Make a grid with 3 columns. So instead of 5, I guess, 1, what was FR? Fraction. 100 pixels and 2 fraction. Hello. What? We should have 3 columns and not none. Let's try again. 1 FR. Oh, no commas, that was the thing. Okay, 100 pixels, 2 FR. That was the issue. Okay, so again, 3 has double the space. I guess we can add this. Or we can add this part. Create a column gap using grid column gap. Pretty straightforward. So far in the grids you've created, the columns have all been tight up against each other. Sometimes you want a gap between the columns. To add a gap between the columns, use the grid column gap property like this. Grid column gap 10 pixels. This creates 10 pixels of empty space between all of our columns. Give the columns in the grid a 20 pixel gap. Okay, so just grid column gap 20 pixels. Nice, 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 nice. Makes sense. It's the same as the example. Next up is create a row gap using grid row gap. Same as column gap. So grid row gap 5px. That's it. Pretty easy peasy. Add gaps faster with grid gap. What's that supposed to mean? Grid gap. Grid gap is a shorthand property for grid row gap and grid column gap. From the previous 2 challenges, that's more convenient to use. If grid gap has 1 value, it will create a gap between all rows and columns. However, if there are 2 values, it will use the first one to set a gap between the rows and the second one for the columns. Use grid gap to introduce 10 and 20. Okay. Grid gap 10 pixels, 20 pixels. Yep. Oops. Here. Okay. Use grid column to control spacing. Whoa, what's this? Okay, so I'll delete this part. Interesting that this is not an image. Oops. Okay, time to use screenshot. Oops. I installed screenshot and share X. No, I don't want screenshot. I finished setting up share X. Green X. Share X. Okay. Okay, up to this point, all the properties that have been discussed are for grid containers. The grid column property is the first one for use on the grid items themselves. The hypothetical horizontal and vertical lines that create the grid are referred to as lines. These lines are numbered starting with 1 at the top left corner of the grid and move right for columns and down for rows, counting upwards. This is what the lines look like for a 3x3 grid. Okay, so to control the amount of columns an item will consume. Oh wait, I'm a bit confused. Grid containers. Items themselves. Okay, so we're talking about the lines, right? To control the amount of columns an item will consume, you can use the grid column property in conjunction with the line numbers you want the item to start and stop at. Here's an example, grid column 1 to 3. This will make the item start at the first vertical line of the grid on the left and span to the third line of the grid, consuming 2 columns. Did we use grid column before? Isn't that... Oh, grid template column. Okay, columns. Okay, that's why I got confused. Then everything makes a bit more sense. Make the item with the class item 5 consume the last 2 columns of the grid. Where's item 5? Here. Last 2 columns of the grid. Okay, so grid column. So it should start with 3 and it should span over 2, right? Why didn't that work? Oh, to stop at. Okay, not how many. Okay, sorry. So 4. No. Why? Oh, again, we're talking about lines. Okay, there we go. Finally. I finally got it. Right, from 1 to 3. Right, so 2 to 4. That makes sense. Took a while for the rows and columns to work. Huh. Okay, looks like I forgot to give this one a number. Of course, you can make items consume multiple rows, just like you can with columns. You define the horizontal lines you want an item to start and stop at using the grid row property on a grid item. Make the element item 5 consume the last 2 rows. So grid row, again 2 to 4, I guess. No, 1 to 3. 2 to 4 works as well. No, it was 2 to 3. 2 to 4. Because... Okay, because this is the first line, right. Here. Okay. Align an item horizontally using justify self. In CSS Grid, the content of each item is located in a box which is referred to as a cell. You can align the content's position with its cell horizontally using the justify self property on a grid item. By default, this property has a value of stretch, which will make the content fill the whole width of the cell. The CSS Grid property accepts other values as well, start, center, end. Okay, that makes sense. Use the justify self property to center the item with the class item 2. Item 2, justify self, center. Let's see what start does. Oh, so what happened to the width? Oh, it was stretch. Okay, that's why. So right now, the other ones are stretch, right? And if I do center, it'll be in the center, but it'll be small. Yeah. Okay. Align an item vertically should be the same or very similar. You can align self property, align self. So justify self and then align self. Align self end or start or center. Okay, and it wants us to use end. There we go. Align all items horizontally using justify items. So the first one was justify self. Sometimes you want all the items in your CSS grid to share the same alignment. You can use the previously learned properties and align them individually, or you can align them all at once horizontally by using justify items on your grid container. This property can accept all the same values you learned about in the previous two challenges, the difference being that it will move all the items in our grid to the desired alignment. Use a property to center all our items horizontally. So this is the container, right? Justify items, center. So now they're all justified, all aligned. Okay, same thing for, instead of align self, 1.7.12, we can probably just say align items, center, but it says it should be end. Okay, that should work. There we go. Divide the grid into an area template. You can group cells of your grid together into an area and give the area a custom name. Do this by using grid template areas on the container, like this. Grid template areas, header, 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 advert, content, content, footer, footer, footer. The code above merges the top three cells together into an area named header, the bottom three cells into a footer area, and it makes two areas in the middle row, advert and content. Note, every word in the code represents a cell, and every pair of quotation marks represents a row. That makes sense-ish. In addition to custom labels, you can use a period to designate an empty cell in the grid. Place the area template so that the cell labeled advert becomes an empty cell. Okay, so it's already here. So I just do this. I guess that's it. I mean, I guess empty doesn't mean that it deletes the content. It's just there is no name for that area, I guess? Or did something change? No.
Here, advert and then two contents, and then the last three are the footer cells. You can use a period to designate an empty cell in the grid. And that's what we'll do for this challenge. So instead of the word advert here, I'm just going to put a period, and that designates it as an empty cell.
Okay. Nothing spectacular. Pasted the sample, the solution. Place items in grid areas using the grid area property. Well, that makes sense. I guess if we create grid areas, we also want to be able to place items in them. Sorry about that. After creating an areas template for your grid container, as shown in the previous challenge, you can place an item in your custom area by referencing the name you gave it. To do this, use the grid area property on an item like this. Item 1, grid area header. This lets the grid know that you want the item 1 class to go in the area named header. In this case, the item will use the entire top row because that whole row is named as the header area. Place an element with item 5 class in the footer area using the grid area property. Dot item grid area footer. Okay, that makes total sense. And if I say content, it'll be the boxes, two boxes, and if I say advert, it'll probably replace 4. Oh, it actually pushed it away. Interesting. Interesting. Kind of. And what if 2 of them have the same thing? Don't need the background. What about this? What if both are advert? I guess that worked, like if I delete this. Right. Okay, so it's just doing it in this order then. It's placing this one first and then it's placing this one. So we can delete all of that, change this to footer, and continue. Pretty simple. Use grid area without creating an areas template. The grid area property you learned in the last challenge can be used in another way. If your grid doesn't have an areas template to reference, you can create an area on the fly for an item to be placed like this. Item 1 grid area 1, 1, 2, 4. This is using the line numbers you learned about earlier to define where the area for this item will be. The numbers in the example above represent these values. Grid area represent these values. Grid area, horizontal line to start at, vertical line to start at, horizontal line to end at, vertical line to end at. So the item in the example will consume the rows between lines 1 and 2 and the columns between lines 1 and 4. Using the grid area property, item 5, place the element with item 5 class between the 3rd and 4th horizontal lines and between the 1st and 4th vertical lines. So this is item 5, which is pale green, and I do grid area between the 3rd and 4th horizontal line, 1st and 4th vertical lines. 4, 4. I think this is what it should be like, of course without the D. Yeah, I think that's it. Yep. Reduce repetition using the repeat function. When you use the grid template columns and grid template rows to define the structure of a grid, you entered a value for each row or column you created. Let's say you want a grid with 100 rows of the same height. It isn't very practical to insert 100 values individually. But didn't I just say how many? Oh, a value for each row, right, okay. Fortunately, there's a better way by using the repeat function to specify the number of times you want your column or row to be repeated, followed by a comma and the value you want to repeat. Here's an example. I would create the 100 row grid, each row at 50 pixels tall. Repeat 100 rows, so grid template rows, and then repeat 100 rows with 50 pixels height. You can also repeat multiple values with the repeat function and insert the function amongst other values when defining a grid structure. Here's what I meant. Who are you? Grid template columns. Repeat to 1 fraction, 50 pixels, 20 pixels. This translates to 1 FR 50 pixel, 1 FR 50. So we're saying like twice. I guess. 150, 150, 150, 20. Use repeat to remove repetition from the grid template columns property. Grid template columns, so we can do repeat 3, 1 FR. That's it, right? Yes. Limit item size using the min-max function. There's another built-in function to use with grid template columns and grid template rows called min-max. It's used to limit the size of items when the grid container changes size. To do this, you need to specify the acceptable size range for your item. Okay, so it uses the limit size of items. It's used to limit the size of items when the grid container changes size. To do this, you need to specify the acceptable size range. Here's an example. 100 pixels, min-max 50, 200. In the code above is set to create two columns. The first is 100 pixels wide. The second has a minimum width of 50 pixels and a maximum width of 200 pixels. Replace 1 FR in the repeat function with a column size that has the minimum width of 90 and maximum of 1 FR. And resize the preview panel. Okay, it kind of makes sense, but what I don't understand, like it doesn't say anything that for, so this is the min value and max value, and for everything in between it will calculate whatever is in between these two values and take, that value, or how does this work? So min-max, repeat 3, min-max 90 pixels, 1 FR. Not sure this worked. I guess this is right. Yeah. I didn't see, so this is the column width. So minimum is 90. Oh, minimum is 90, that's why. Okay, so, and anything that's above that, it will stretch equally. Okay, yeah. So it does calculate whatever, it does calculate the values in between. Okay. Create flexible layouts using autofill. The repeat function comes with an option called autofill. This allows you to automatically insert as many rows or columns of your desired size as possible depending on the size of the container. You can create flexible layouts when combining autofill with min-max. Interesting. Min-max. So using min-max together with autofill can lead to interesting results. I can already feel that. In the preview, grid template column is set to repeat autofill min-max 60 pixels to 1 fraction. When the container changes size, this setup keeps inserting 60 pixel columns and stretching them until it can insert another one. If your container can't fit all your items on one row, it will move them down to a new one. In the first grid, use autofill with repeat to fill the grid with columns that have a minimum width of 60 and maximum of 1 FR, then resize the preview window. So do we have any autofill here? Okay, none yet. Right, so repeat autofill. Autofill, that's it. Okay, so this is the first grid. This is the second grid, I think, right? Oh no, this is the second grid, this is the first grid, okay. I think. I'll just, to make sure, if I do this, these will change, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so if I change the size now, it will remove number 5, I'm guessing. Oh, okay, so I see. Oh, nice. Okay, this is pretty responsive design. Nice. So it just pushes it down there, and if you have space, it leaves it up here. Okay, this makes sense. And this is correct. Create flexible layouts using Autofit. Autofit works almost identically to Autofill. The only difference is that when the container's size exceeds the size of all the items combined, Autofill keeps inserting empty rows or columns and pushes your items to the side, while Autofit collapses those empty rows or columns and stretches your items to fit the size of the container. Note, if your container can't fit all your items in one row, it will move them down to a new one. In the second grid, okay, so this is what Autofill did. And let's try Autofit. Ah, that's pretty cool. So it always stretches it. So the only difference is the last item though. Right, so autofill stops. And then it doesn't change the width anymore. And autofit is just like justify or something. Okay, I think what would be interesting would be back, no, here. Right, so this is what happens before Autofit or autofill, right? And then for this one, it's autofill. Oh, don't need the second one actually, so let's crop this. Can I crop here? Crop. No cropping. Crap. If there's no cropping, that's crap. Oh, sorry. Okay, so just need this. And for here as well. Crop. So what this does is this one. Right? Kinda. I mean, does that help? Yeah, it does help. And auto fit. Something like that. Use media queries to create responsive layouts. And again, media queries. CSS Grid can be an easy way to make your site more responsive by using media queries to rearrange grid areas, change dimensions of a grid, and rearrange the placement of items. In the preview, when the viewport width is 300 pixels or more, the number of columns changes from 1 to 2. What? Let's see. So now they're just stacked on top of each other. And then advert, that's the same as, yeah. Okay. Huh. Okay, I think I kind of grid template columns. So, right, okay. So container, it should have just one fraction of, like it should fill the whole container size, the container, and then it should have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows and a grid gap of 10 pixels and yada yada, grid template areas. Oh, okay, so this is just 4 rows. And then if the width is 300 or more, it should have 2 columns, right? Auto and 1 fraction. So auto just takes sets the width to exactly as wide as the content. And then rows, it should have 1, 2, 3 rows. 1, 2, 3, right? And the areas are advert header, advert content, and advert footer. And then, right, when the viewport width is 400 or more, make the header area occupy the top row completely. Oh, how did we make this occupy the row completely? It had something with lines, area, grid. So create custom areas. Grid area. Here. I think that's what it should have. Grid area. So the header, make the header area occupy the top row completely. But I don't know how to make the header area. Like, wait, I'm a bit confused. Grid area. So let's just try. So this is probably wrong, but this is somehow the only thing that I can remember. Make the header area occupy the top row completely. So it would start from the first line to the third line, right? Oops, not here. Like this. And the footer area occupy the bottom row completely. Okay, so I guess this is wrong. Container. Grid template areas. Oh. Grid template areas. Right. Maybe I do like, I don't know if I do it in here. No, I don't do it in here. I do it in here. Dot footer. Does this make sense? Grid. Oh, I'm pretty confused. Oh, okay, let's read the instruction here. When the viewpoint is 400 or more, alright, we're down here. Container class, right, should have a grid template area, grid template areas, not just grid areas. Oh, okay, just like just like this. So make the header area so it's just this. Now the header area is the entire row. Footer occupy the bottom row. That's it. Oh man, this was easy, but okay, so if it's above 400, this is going to happen. If it's between 3 and 400, right, exactly. And if it's less than 300, it's going to stack everything on top of each other. Boom. Bam. Swoom. Boom, bada boom. Okay, whew. That took a while. That wasn't even that complicated, but I guess I can say that it was a little bit more complicated. Create grids within grids. Ooh, gridception. Is it 21? Gridception. Turning an element into a grid only affects the behavior of its direct descendants. So by turning a direct descendant into a grid, you have a grid within a grid. For example, by setting the display and grid template columns properties of the element with the item 3 class, you create a grid within your grid. Turn the element within the item 3 class into a grid with 2 columns with a width of auto and 1 FR using display and grid template columns. Okay, so item 3. So display is grid, right? So it's already a grid now. And then with 2 columns, grid template columns, auto 1FR. Yes, this should be right. Okay. This is kind of interesting. So we created a grid using this display grid within a grid. So this container is a grid, I guess? Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I'd like to have the solution here. No. That was a short course, Introduction to the Responsive Web Design Projects. Oh yeah, this is the more fun part. This is when things get harder. We have to find solutions, I guess. Okay, so I would like to end this video here. I'll start with the projects in the next video, and then of course, let's see, this is day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is day 5. So hopefully, not tomorrow, but on Sunday, I'll be able to prepare a summary video. So today and tomorrow will be the projects. Build a tribute page, build a survey form, product landing page, technical documentation, bottom page, personal portfolio web page. Okay, so I don't know how difficult these will be. Maybe we'll be able to finish one in an hour in the next video, or maybe we'll be able to finish a few more, but we'll see. So thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.